You're okay, great. Well, yeah, it's really nice to meet you, Marcela. I got recommended to chat with you through Lay Taff from the National Bonsai and Pinjing Museum in Canberra. So yeah, he recommended I reach out to you. And so just to kind of set the stage, I'm starting to talk to various bonsai professionals from around the world to try to get a sense of what bonsai looks like in the respective kind of major countries of the world. A little bit of inspiration from the World Cup next year happening, this idea of kind of, sport as this kind of global unifier and how each country has its own team and it sort of represents the nation. And, there's kind of these unique cultural distinctions that sort of are represented in how teams play and their style. And, we can see a little bit of that represented in bonsai in terms of like the difference between Japanese bonsai and Chinese pinjing, and kind of how you can see the cultural aesthetic and the cultural values kind of reflected in bonsai. And I kind of got curious of whether or not that's true for all countries. Like, is there a point at which you can kind of see a national style that's kind of more reflective of maybe the US or of Spain or of Australia? And so I don't know the answer to that yet. I'm starting to kind of get a sense of what that might look like. But talking to individuals like yourself who are working in that country to kind of get your perspective just on your own approach to bonsai, how you kind of how does the environment influence your style, and how does that maybe help contribute to this identity, of what Australian bonsai looks like, or what is that? And so yeah, that's kind of a little bit of the background for kind of how we are coming at the conversation today.
Hmm.
So I was able to send you kind of some questions kind of to review for our conversation. And I don't know much about you personally, so yeah, I'd love you to share just kind of a little bit about your story, just kind of how you got into bonsai and how you got to where you are today.
Well, I was originally probably would have gone back to when I was around 14. I'm sort of the Karate Kid era. There's quite a few of us sort of around the sort of 50 mark, 52, 53. We're inspired by watching the Karate Kid. So I remember watching Karate Kid and, with my sisters, my brothers and sister, and on VHS tape. I don't know, from, the VHS, the old video, you'd have to put it in. And I remember watching Mr. Miyagi going up to the mountain and, collecting a pine. And I just distinctively just remember that scene. And I remember saying to myself, one day I want to do that. And I'd always sort of had it in the back of my mind. And probably when I was around 18, 19, I think, well, actually around 19, my ex-partner, I'd mentioned that I was interested in bonsai. So she gifted me a little incorrectly labeled maple.
Mm,
And it's just those little pots that, little sticks in a pot that, you buy for like whatever, however amount of money it was. And it was incorrectly labeled as a cerisa, which meant I could keep it indoors. So I
mhm.
kept it indoors and overwatered it and killed it. But it didn't put me off because it was something I really wanted to keep going with. So, and probably driving around, I don't know, one day we popped into a garage sale and I ended up buying a peppercorn tree, Shonas mole, from a guy that was just selling some of his collection off. And that was quite an old established tree. So I kind of sort of just, it's went off from there. Then I did a beginner's class at a local bonsai nursery in the Dandenongs, and from there I just started purchasing more and more trees, mostly obviously on exotics. Natives weren't in the radar back then. And I kept playing with exotics. I wasn't a member of any clubs. The internet was, more of a new, wasn't much of a thing back then. So references were really just books if I bothered to look at them. And it was pretty much what I'd sort of seen in books and stuff like that, how I kept styling my trees. And around probably 2010, I became interested got a bit sort of bored of the exotics, and I became really interested in something different. So my partner urged me to buy, something different. We went to a bonsai nursery, and they were selling an incorrectly labelled. They labelled it as a river red gum, a eucalypt, but it actually turned out to be something else. But anyway, I brought that home, and I kept sort of pushing it to do what it didn't naturally do. And I didn't quite understand, that natives had a completely different growing aesthetics. And so I was trying to grow this particular tree as a cascade, and it just kept saying no to me, no to me. For about 3 years, I just kept persevering, like, stupidly persevering. And it wasn't until I attended the symposium in Canberra, the second symposium in Canberra, where they were focusing on Australian natives as bonsai. And that just cemented it to me that, that was the path, the path and the avenue that I wanted to go down, and started growing more natives, because they had a show there, an exhibition that basically was just, I don't know, 30 or 40 trees, and they were all natives. And, and everyone had their own representation of how to style their natives. It wasn't your cookie cutter looking like a pine sort of thing. And that was really interesting to me. So when I came back to Melbourne, I sort of wanted to, I had like a big spring in my step, and wanted to get more information. And it was, information was pretty scarce here. Mostly, a lot of it too was misinformation. We were being told that, oh, you can only repot natives on the hottest days of the year. Oh, you can't repot natives. You can't do anything to them. They're useless. They're too brittle. They're not worth playing with, and blah blah blah. So it was always, a lot of it was really discouraging. And I like kept saying to my, saying in, in my, out in across the road from me, when I walk my dogs, it's just our trees, and all I wanted to do was miniaturize them. So I wasn't put off by that. And so one day I turned around to my friend, who's a very highly regarded bonsai artist here, and I said to him, I'm going to start a club. And he laughed at me, and I said, no, I'm going to start a club. And I said, if I find a venue, I said, we're going to do this. And within 3 or 4 days, I found a venue. And then we had our first meeting in September of 2013. We had about 40 people that attended, and many of them are still members. Some of them moved on, and some of them have passed away. But now, 12 or 13 years later, we've got about 260 members, and they're all Australia-wide, because we're the only club in Australia that focuses on natives. So, yeah, I'm pretty proud of the fact that, my urging and my wanting to really find out more about, growing our trees and really sort of, I guess, not pushing, but just trying to get people to see the beauty behind them, has really put natives in the forefront in people's minds. So that, yeah, that's sort of a little bit about me and where I'm at. So basically now I solely focus on natives. Since then, my collection is pretty much 99.9% natives. So I try and play around. Now, when I say play around, I mean, I get more pleasure of getting something, tube stock or a little bit more advanced, and just learning its little, nuances and, idiosyncrasies, and just working my way through. I really enjoy all that. And when I get a tree to a certain stage where it's pretty much show condition, I tend to get a little bit bored, because I feel like I've got there, the tree looks nice, but it's not offering me much more in terms of a learning experience. So I'm always sort of finding things that I just want to keep learning with, and I'll never, a lot of people, when I travel throughout Australia, well, mostly through the eastern states, when I'm invited to demonstrator clubs, a lot of them introduce me as, the native expert. And I always say, I'm not an expert, because there's no way I'll ever learn. I'll be able to play around or even get to learn about every single species that we have in our country. There's no way. I said, but I just know a little bit more than you guys. That's the only difference. That's what I always say to people. But yeah, so that's pretty much me in a nutshell.
That's great. It's really interesting to hear, your kind of initial exposure to bonsai, which, yeah, similarly, the Karate Kid was a big influence on myself. And then that kind of attraction to it. But then it sounded like pretty quickly on in your process, you moved away from the kind of traditional species, and maybe even not so much the commitment to styling trees traditionally, maybe a little bit, but pretty rapidly maybe having an interest in your native trees. I'm curious if you know much about, like, I know a little bit of history on Australian bonsai, but I'm definitely by no means an expert. I know the kind of the influence of the Kirchhoffs kind of early on. I guess, how would you describe kind of Australia's uh, journey with bonsai? I know John Naka coming there in like the 70s was really, or 80s was really instrumental. So I guess how does the overall country kind of has progressed from kind of more of that focus on exotic Japanese species and kind of traditional bonsai to now, or this emerging kind of interest in native trees and kind of the styling them to reflect just the Australian natural tree forms that you guys have. Like, do you know much about that kind of history at all?
Yeah, I definitely the coral shrubs were a massive influence in terms of where I guess how people started using started doing bonsai. They also had a big part in styling natives as well.
Mm,
Um, they produced a small little book which a lot of people call, sort of called it the guide, the Bible to Australian
mhm,
natives. But a lot of it were still I guess I suppose some people, when it came to the natives, were sort of using that as a Bible, and hence they probably thought that they were the only species that that they could sort of play with, because they were the only ones that the corals managed to be able to get to survive. In terms of styling and all of that overall, I mean, in terms of bonsai, really we're very young in terms of doing it. It's probably only been in the sort of 1940s, 1950s where bonsai in itself started to become a thing. Interestingly, being a female and not many females being sort of in terms of being tutors or anything like or sort of in that scale. I've been able to find out, doing a little bit of research, I've been able to find out that a lot of when natives, sorry, when bonsai sort of started to become a thing in Australia, a lot of housewives took it up. Probably around in the 50s and 60s, obviously because the husbands were at work, so there was something for the women to do. So a lot of the clubs, when they sort of were formed, a lot of them were formed by females, which was really interesting. But now you sort of step back and it's the other way around. There's a lot more males doing it than what there are females.
mhm,
But in terms of the styling, very traditional, extremely
mhm,
traditional, still sort of, and even so today, and to the point where even with Australian natives, you find a lot of people that are using the very traditional way of styling our trees.
mhm,
And I think I learned early on, there's no point, fighting the natural growth habit of our trees.
mhm,
And secondly, I just really disliked having, say, for example, the Melaleuca or the photo that I sent you, trying to style that looking like a pine. It just does not work,
mhm,
and I find it conflicting when I see, media posts and I see a Melaleuca or a callistoman or whatever, when most of their growth habit is very deciduous, like, which means going up, and all they've done is like flatten down the branches, just
mhm,
because they think that that's the only way to style bonsai. So in a
mhm,
lot of
mhm,
ways, I think it's still very traditional,
mhm,
and slowly, it's beginning to change, and slowly, as the use of Australian natives is sort of taken, moving forward. A lot more people are starting to appreciate that, yes, maybe we should be using a different way of styling our trees. So it's slowly happening. I'm a big pusher for it, definitely. I just think, and I'm not going there with with a stick and telling people off or anything like that. It's just, I just want people to just realize that we have our own aesthetics and we need to, you know, represent those. And I think that once we get our heads, get our heads around that and break away from that, I think we'll be developing our own style, definitely.
mhm. Yeah, that's interesting. Like I said, it sounds like from a pretty early point on in your interest in bonsai, you kind of had that desire to have the trees. And I don't know how that came about, more just from you seeing the trees not responding to the sort of the styling that the book sort of described, or just your own sort of sense of that. So yeah, maybe you can elaborate, like in your bonsai work, you kind of touched on it a little bit about this kind of desire to continue learning and trying to kind of adapt the trees to the forms that you're seeing. What do you think your work kind of expresses about you personally, or your character, or kind of your beliefs, your life experience? Do you see any kind of connection to kind of your personality and kind of this interest in how you approach bonsai the way that you do?
Yeah, I guess someone else would probably be better off answering that that question. But I guess my philosophy, and I know that one of the questions was sort of, the philosophy, and I sort of stuck to the philosophy side of it. I think my philosophy, if that's the only word to describe it, is just to basically just really use the work with the tree and use the natural habit of the natural growth habit of the tree, of the species that you're working with. I'm very much of early on, as I said, I kept probably for I'm talking about my native bonsai life, which has probably been around 15 years now. For about the first sort of 8 to 9 or so, 8 to 10 years, I very styled a lot of them very traditional, and I still have some of those. And what I've actually, recently I'm basically growing those out so I can actually restyle them to what I find more aesthetically pleasing. So I reckon I had a sort of a massive turnaround probably around, between 5 or 6 years ago, where I just really looked at my trees and I said, what am I doing here? I'm trying to represent what a Japanese tree looks like rather than what our trees look like. So I definitely, and hence why I keep sort of not pushing, but I just keep sort of, gently sort of trying to persuade people that we need to start using, the natural growth habit of our trees and how they naturally grow and how they naturally represent themselves. So I guess that's my philosophy. And in terms of the, I've sort of coined it, and I call it the semi-deciduous style. And by that I mean I love seeing the structure of trees. So I really love a lot of deciduous trees. So it's just the conifers that I'm that just do not do anything for me, because I find them, and each time I sort of see anything, I find them very same, and very sort of triangular, and it just doesn't. And I can't see the structure, and I love seeing the structure of trees. Therefore, I'm always drawn to deciduous trees, and our natives lend themselves to that sort of semi-deciduous state where, when the leaves are just starting to drop. So you're starting to see inside the, the structure of trees. And if you stand far away from our trees, they look very dense. But as soon as you get close and you stand underneath them and you see a lot of light coming through, so, that's what really interests me. So you've got the foliage at the tips. So I've coined it, and I always say to people, this is how I like to style them. And I tried to sort of express to them and explain to them that, and I try to urge them to actually do what I tend to do, which is get underneath trees and stand underneath them and just see how the structure sort of, and how the branches sort of sit on top or next to one another. And that's really important to me. And so, yeah, I guess the philosophy behind it is pretty much how, sort of how I'm drawn to, and what I sort of try and keep, telling people, look, just look at our trees in a different manner and look at, how they naturally sort of tend to do things. And I think you'll, be far more pleased by the results that you'll achieve, really.
Mm-hmm.
So I hope that sort of answers it.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great kind of segue too into the kind of questions that I had about the environment and the landscape of the area that at least that you live in. I think that's a common thread that I'm coming across, is how the the landscape, the environment that people grow or that people live in, that obviously influences the way in which plants grow, like the growth habit, whether you're on the coast or in the mountains or somewhere else, like plants are going to look different based on where they're
Yeah.
growing. And so the landscape plays a huge role in shaping that. So how would you describe the natural landscape where you live?
So obviously I'm in an urban environment living in the city. But can you give me 1 second?
Sure.
Can you walk with me while I
Yeah,
try and answer?
yeah,
Of
absolutely.
course, because it's cold, my dogs are inside, and now they've decided they need to go to the toilet.
Oh yeah, no worries.
Yeah, I let them out before, but it was too cold. They
Too
sort of
cold
put
to,
their
yeah.
noses out.
Yeah.
Okay. Um, so yeah, I'm in an urban environment, obviously, so living in the city. But I'm lucky that obviously having the two dogs that I've just said. I walk my dogs along, and I've got two creeks which meet. So we walk our dogs along there, and the indigenous plants that were locally, they've been sort of naturally growing there, and have also been reintroduced by the land care groups, have played a big pivotal role in what influences me as well, and obviously in how I style my trees. I've got so many different varieties of trees, species that growing within not even 200 meters from me. That's how close I am to the creek, and I can walk for kilometers, and just you'll see different types of trees, and just all inspiring. And we're also lucky that we have a small holiday house in the coast, and so again, I'm very inspired by how the trees naturally grow around there as well. And most of the species along there are Banksias, the coastal tea trees, which is a Gaudium labigatum, and the Leucopogon parvifolia. And they do naturally twisting sort of things and contorted. So the styling and how the trees grow in the coast as opposed to how they grow in the urban environment is much more different. It's very totally opposing, but yet so inspiring to me. So if I've been able to collect a couple of coastal tea trees, so I definitely have styled them very similar to how I see them growing along the coast down there, and similarly with the Banksias too.
So you're in Victoria, is that correct?
Correct. Yeah, in Melbourne.
So
Yeah.
what is that like then like a Mediterranean environment? Like what's the general region's kind of environment like? Is it it's not
Yeah.
it's not coastal? Is it kind of, you know, flat land? Like describe to me kind of just the general region's kind of
Okay.
environment. It's not mountainous, or is it? I'm not familiar at all with
No,
that
no.
region.
Yeah, definitely in the city where I'm living, it's definitely not mountainous. You've got your very small hills and stuff like that.
Mm,
And Mediterranean sort of a little bit further up, probably more sort of Dalesford, which is probably about 100 and so kilometers away. So it's
okay.
so I'm pretty much 8 kilometers from the city,
So it's
and the
like
city
temperate, like it's more of a
very
temperate
temperate. Yeah,
environment.
yeah,
Yeah. So
very
you have
temperate.
the
Yeah, very temperate.
seasons, like you're
Yeah,
saying it's cold. So you're going to
yeah,
have deciduous trees. Do you
yes.
see more like you're sort of talking about the lack of evergreens, or sort of how evergreens aren't really too appealing to you? I mean, do you think that's part of just the fact of are there more kind of semi-deciduous tree species in Australia than like conifers, or like is that
Uh,
just kind of what grows there naturally? Therefore, that's maybe one of the reasons why you're kind of more drawn to that, is you don't see these pine trees like they have in
yeah.
Japan or elsewhere.
Yeah, no, it's definitely because of what I see.
Hmm.
My
Hmm.
natural environment. If I look at my front window right now, I can see mass canopies of all different types of eucalypts.
Hmm.
In my own front yard, I've got an acacia that's at the moment is in flower. There's definitely most of the street plantings are either melaleucas, eucalypts, mostly natives. There are some parts that local councils use deciduous, but most of
Hmm.
them are evergreens. It's just the conifers that I don't like, mainly because of the conical shape that they're always shaped in, but also
Hmm.
because yes, I don't see those here.
Hmm. Hmm.
So it's majority. It's obviously a majority of our flora is indigenous to certain areas, and yeah, it's definitely and most of it is evergreen. There are the introduced exotics that are used as street trees, and I definitely do appreciate those, because going back to the structure, being able to see the structure.
Hmm.
But yes, it's definitely so. It's definitely a temperate climate, just along the coastline, very close to the coast, where I am. And yes, so, and even if you go sort of where I mentioned before, Dalesford, if you go up sort of past, towards Bendigo, all those sort of areas, it's quite much more drier. The summers tend to get a lot hotter there. So the trees definitely display a different character when you go up that way, particularly a lot of eucalypts. They'll
Hmm.
be much more distressed. There'll be a lot more age. There'll be elements. They're definitely displaying elements of the environmental factors that they're putting up with, basically, or they're living with, or persevering with.
So are eucalyptus, are those the kind of the major kind of species of tree that sort of exists in and around where you're at? Is that like the dominant
Definitely,
species? Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. I
definitely,
mean,
yeah.
I love eucalyptus because I grew up in Southern California, and they do really well in California with that Mediterranean climate. And so when you talk about that kind of semi-deciduous style where you can see the branching and
Mm.
the leaves kind of at the tips, I know exactly what you're referring to
Mm-hmm.
in the eucalyptus themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So so it sounds like though when you're going to maybe get inspired, you have access to this creek by your home and then the coastal environment. Are those kind of the two main regions that you're drawn to when you're sort of looking for inspiration, or that you could sort of see represented in kind of the trees that you're drawn to and the styles that you sort of that resonate with you more?
Yeah, definitely. I don't get away much sort of, interstate in terms of, I mean, I get to go to for work interstate, and I definitely try and look at trees while I'm being ferried from my hotel to the venue and then back to the back to the
Mhm.
hotel. So I haven't been able to, sort of get out to see the country more. But I definitely do also, look at follow. I don't follow much, and you may ask me this later on, but I don't follow a lot of bonsai artists. I just don't want to be. I guess when I went down the avenue, okay, this is how I want to style my trees. I just didn't want to be have any confusion in how I saw trees. So going back to your question, I try and see more sort of follow things where I'm seeing a lot more natural photos and natural scenic sort of photos that have been shared, and I sort of
Mm.
that obviously that are outside of Victoria. Just to give me an idea of, just to give me ideas. I mean, if I'm lucky enough to be, come across a piece of material which has got age to it, then I might be able to, use some of that inspiration and put that into that tree. But yeah, it's definitely mostly what I'm surrounded by, because that's what I'm spending most of my time at. And also too, one other thing that I probably need to mention too is the availability of material in terms of natives. It's very scarce.
Hmm.
Mostly because, like I said, we haven't been using them for a very long time. The advantage is that they grow very quickly. A lot of species grow very quickly. So within 5 years, from if you're starting from tube stock, and if you put really interesting character and movement, and you know how to grow them, you can have an interesting tree. But certainly, if you were, we're never going to be able to replicate. Replicate. And I say replicate. Something that looks about, some of our eucalypts can be about 500 years old, and you're never going to be able to create that age.
Hmm.
Whereas, you can sort of do that with some pines and, and some junipers, and, because they're
Hmm.
collecting age. So we're never going to be able to recreate that. But I think what we are able to, what we are achieving is quite worthy at this, given the stage that we're at in terms of using natives.
Hmm. Yeah. Why? So I'm curious, and this is kind of maybe transitioning more into like a broader discussion about kind of Australian culture, but why do you think that there's not as much bonsai material, or even just plant material? You're saying sort of native plant material. Are native plants viewed collectively, not just within the bonsai world, but in sort of culture in general, as not as valuable or not admired, or I mean, you were able to start a whole natives kind of bonsai club, which I'm not familiar of any other kind of native sort of clubs of that nature. So yeah, what is the view of Australian bonsai practitioners and maybe the larger culture in general towards native flora?
Um, Again, it comes down to, I can't say that it's split 50-50 in terms of one way or the other. I think the traditional sort of way of seeing bonsai and how it's represented is just is the to me is the big I suppose the big stopping point, that it's which isn't allowing, I get, for lack of a better word, for allowing many to view our trees, and see the beauty and see how the potential that they actually have. There's a lot of people that are very stuck in, oh no, but it it's a native. Sorry, it's a native, so it's not worthy of anything. I mean, even when it comes to sales at like at club shows, for example, you'll have a really nice refined native, and you'll have a not so refined maybe pine or something. And this is not at our club, because obviously at our club we only sell native material. But if you go to a normal bonsai club, they'll have, you might have a sales table where they'll have, a mixture of things. And definitely the native won't get as much, even though it's refined, as as much as what a pine or a juniper would. people still have this perception as natives being the lesser cousin. If you sort of understand that term. I don't know why. I think for a lot of people that misconception still sticks in their heads that they're too hard to do. They're too finicky. They're too brittle. But I think if people just took the time and to actually sort of realize and actually played around with a few more natives, I think they would realize that no, they're nowhere near as hard and far more rewarding to me. And I am biased, I understand that, but far more rewarding to me visually than, something that doesn't represent our country, does something that doesn't represent our environment. So yeah, I honestly, I still get baffled by it, because you see a lot of other countries, and I know we're probably going to touch on this, but going back to what you sort of touched on earlier on, you see a lot of countries and a lot of artists starting to use more of their native material, and they're slowly going away from the traditional way of doing things. And I still sort of find that we're kind of at a crossroads, and there's like a push and pull. And some are definitely wanting to go down that path because you're seeing it a lot more. And it's probably more from the younger people that are coming on into the scene, not so much with the older ones. The older ones are like pretty much stuck. No, you're not going to sell it to me. It's a native. Even in the nursery industry, in terms of just general gardening, putting a native plant into the garden, there's a lot of myths that they still keep perpetuating. And I think people hear that, and then they think, oh well, if it's going to be a pain putting into the ground, then why am I going to bother trying to grow it in a container? So I mean, so I think we're definitely at a push-pull situation at the moment, or at a crossroads where I think maybe the younger ones are hopefully going to start embracing natives a lot more, and I think we're definitely going to see a push. But I think it's just going to take a little while because you still have the older ones that, that generational gap where they're still very much, no, that's, they're not bonsai. I remember in 20. When was it? I was in another club, one of the second clubs that I joined, when I initially started joining clubs, which was back in 2012. And it was one of the premier Victorian clubs. And I'd put in my sticky wattle, which is Acacia howidii. So it's got pendulous sort of growth. So nothing like it, your traditional sort of bonsai. And we introduced the Public's Choice in that show. And that tree won the Public's Choice. And the next meeting, when we took the trees back, we went to the next meeting after the show. I had my tree up on display because, it's just the thing, and, showed the little best in show, blah, blah, blah. And one of the old timers said to me, she stood up and she said, oh, that's not bonsai. That shouldn't have won. So it's that mentality, which unfortunately there's still quite a lot of. And don't get me wrong, I'm not bagging it, or I'm just pointing it out that I think that's where we're at the moment. There's that mentality, and we're slowly sort of just starting to push through. But it's going to take a little while. I really think it's going to take a while.
Yeah, that's interesting that you bring up the People's Choice Award, and I'm curious too about, one of the broader conversations is how does culture influence our ideas of beauty and value and influence the things we create. And Australia is such a big country and is so kind of geographically diverse, much like the United States. To say that there's this, like, people who live in the Pacific Northwest are very different culturally from the people who live like in the Southeast or something like that, right? We all live in the United States, we're all Americans, but at the same time, like, it's not a homogenous kind of, like, there's regions to our countries. And so I'm curious, like, what regional differences exist between Australia and within the bonsai community? Since you've traveled around, do you see regional differences that exist within the bonsai community itself? And then also larger too, like, just in Australia, I've never been. I mean, I know it as a place of natural beauty and diverse, flora and fauna, and really rich in its kind of natural resources. And so I'm curious about kind of, is there kind of like what is the Australians' relationship with nature? Like, do some people view it as like conflict, or some people view it as a kind of relationship? Or I guess, yeah, can you kind of articulate some of that maybe a little bit to help me understand? Yeah, are there any kind of like broad cultural understandings of like Australians' relationship to nature, and then regional differences about that?
Um, it's how do I answer that? um, there, I think we're definitely very in touch with nature. And in a lot of ways, I mean, a lot of us tend to travel within Australia to try and, have holidays within Australia just because of the beauty that there is. Particularly from, like, I'm at the bottom of the of Eastern Australia, up north, going up along the coast, sort of, past Brisbane, going up into Cairns, into Darwin, and then sort of doing a whole, sort of a whole sort of round trip. The the scenery is just stunning, and it just varies so much from urban environments. So we definitely do have an affinity with culture, but also because I'm sorry, with the environment, but also we I don't know. I mean, I would say that America tends to get a lot of issues, and I think it's probably a worldwide thing now with climate changing. But we've kind of have no choice in terms of being in touch with the environment because we're subjected to floods, bushfires. So you're very aware of those things. If you make a choice as to where you're going to, so to speak, if you move to a different part of Australia or a particular part, just even me, if I the coast, the house, the holiday house that we have along the coast, there's a high, even though it's on the coast, there's a high probability of bushfires there. So all these things come into play, when it comes to the relationship that we have with our environment. So yeah, I'd say that we definitely do have a big affinity. And in terms of how it represents in bonsai, there's definitely, I haven't been to Western Australia, but on what I see on online, there's because what happens with Australia, they're almost like we call them a separate country. They have their
Mm-hmm.
own quarantine rules, so
Mm-hmm.
nothing can actually go into to WA. So they're very much, all the bonsai clubs or all the bonsai practitioners have to use stock that's either been grown from seed, decades ago, or they're forced to use the native material, much more so than what. And similarly with Tasmania as well, which is down south, so a little bit down below Victoria. So all along the eastern of Australia, we definitely have access to material, your exotic material much more readily than what happens in Tasmania or in WA. So in WA, they tend to use a lot more, their native Melaleucas and Kunzias and things like that. But I've also noticed that the styling has been very, very traditional.
Mm-hmm.
So again, it comes back to the influences that they've had. I suppose the people that they've had coming over, in terms of tutors as well, have sort of developed or influenced the way they've been styling their natives as well. Mostly because those tutors are very more Japanese influenced as well, so they sort of take that on, over there, and that's how. So you definitely see a lot more use of natives in WA, but you definitely see it more in terms of the styling in a very traditional sort of manner. So yeah, I think try and answer your, I hope I'm sort of answering your question. We're definitely, I think, yeah, as Australians, in a lot of ways, we're definitely in touch with our environment. But when it comes to bonsai, it's different. We're definitely, yeah. Look, yeah, it's a hard question, to be honest with
Mm-hmm.
you.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you trying to answer.
Yeah,
I've noticed that too as I'm trying to ask these large questions. It's difficult for people to feel like they either can speak to the like, well, I don't, want to represent my whole country, or, these
yeah, yeah,
sort of hemming and hawing about it, which I get. It's a hard question, but I'm also, that's why I'm trying to talk to individuals just to get a sense of their own approach. And maybe, it's kind of like with a bonsai, it's much easier to tell somebody else what they need to do with their own tree than trying to figure out what I need to do with
yeah,
my own. And so from
yeah,
an outsider perspective, like myself looking in, I might see things, but then I also don't know if I'm I'm sort of guessing at that too. I mean, one of the things that's curious, and I'm sort of going back to this sort of the idea of the depreciation for native material in Australia. You know, I know the typical pattern has been, you know, with anything, right? You sort of are exposed to something, you're trying to learn it, you're imitating that process, whether it's like learning how to play a sport or a musical instrument or whatever. You're learning something, so it's all imitation. You're just practicing, doing the thing that you sort of have seen, and you get sort of good enough to be able to develop the techniques to kind of then create something that's a little bit more unique and authentic to yourself. And so one of the questions that I sort of have is a factor of time, because when we look at countries like Japan and China and other Asian countries that have been doing bonsai for hundreds and hundreds of years, and maybe even some places in Europe and America as well. But yeah, I mean, most of the Western countries have been doing bonsai for, you know, less than 100 years. Um, is that kind of a component for this idea of culture to kind of, or a unique expression of culture to come out after you've been doing it for so long that you've kind of gone through that phase of kind of imitating someone else and then sort of developing your own you know, your own style. And so I'm wondering if that's just one of the big kind of things that we don't have enough of in the West, is time doing it in order to have
Mm.
this kind of very distinct style. Because, you know, one of the things that I'm also kind of asking people, and a lot of people are able to say yes to this, but I'm interested to hear your perspective, is like, you know, in Europe at least, there's a lot of shows where they bring trees from all around Europe and they will display them. And a lot of them are known because they're, you know, it's like a work of art. They know who made it, and that's that person's tree. But then also there's the opportunity to kind of like look and be like, oh, can you distinguish a tree that's from France, from Spain, from Italy, just by looking at it without, you know, if you didn't know whose tree it was, could you kind of guess where those trees came from geographically? And a lot of the people I've spoken to have said yes. But I'm also curious from your perspective, like if you were to be able to put Australian bonsai in one of the, you know, if we were able to get like a global show with like trees from all over the globe, like would you think Australian trees would stand out in a way that would make them distinctly Australian?
In terms of natives, do you mean, or
Just yeah,
Australian bonsais?
or just kind of what you like, what you kind of assess Australian bonsai to be like. Yeah, if you were to, I guess if you were to sort of take a couple representatives, I
Mm.
don't know, like how would they stand out as distinct in your opinion, or would they? I don't know.
Well, obviously, if they were natives, they would definitely stand out because they'd be totally different to everything
Mm-hmm.
else that was there.
Mm-hmm.
But if we were just putting in, your typical exotic, I don't know, maybe a pine or a juniper or a an English elm or something. I think, I well, my very close friend Quentin Valentine, he has a stunning collection, and I haven't seen a lot of collections within Australia, but I would say that it's pretty much up there as almost being one of the best. And his trees would definitely stand up there. And could go into into an international collection easily. Would they be distinct in terms of styling, or would they be any different to something? I don't think so.
Mm-hmm.
I think that a lot of his collection, you would definitely, without a doubt, it could sit, amongst the Japanese show and exhibition,
Mm-hmm.
and it would be well worthy of being there. But does it look any different? I don't think so. I
Mm-hmm.
think the only thing that would sort of make it differently would be just having actually a native up there. One
Mm-hmm.
of the best, and again, he grows quite a few natives as well, and he's got a lot of, really nice looking trees, but very traditional again.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that because he's been doing bonsai for such a long time, that I think, we all get to that point where we just start reproducing very similar, styles.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think, definitely, I mean, you could put one of his natives into one of those exhibitions and it would stand out just because it's a native. But in terms of styling, it would very much traditional.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas if like, if I was worthy enough of having one of my trees up there, it would definitely stand out. So,
Mm-hmm.
and in terms of other stuff that I've seen, yeah, I think, yeah, if it's not a native, there'd be sort of some slight nuances, I guess, that,
Mm-hmm.
would probably, you might just be able to pick up.
Mm-hmm.
I couldn't tell you what they were, but you definitely
Mm-hmm.
sort of pick them up. I mean, I maybe look from what I've seen, from the collections that I've been lucky to be in preview of, even just for the national collection in Canberra, just seeing, what gets taken up there and gets displayed there, exhibited there. You sort of do pick up some slight nuances, but then you sort of look at it from afar and then it kind of just looks like, they'll look a little bit similar to, a European one or a Japanese. So,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
so
Mm-hmm.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, so
So I hope,
there's kind of that distinction between whether it's being styled as a bonsai, uh,
yeah.
or or more of a native reflection of, or
Mm,
a reflection of kind of your native forms.
mm.
Yeah, that's interesting. What do you see any sort of values, like cultural values that Australians have that sort of influence the way that bonsai is practiced? And so, for example, speaking to someone from Germany, they described how German culture is very focused on the rules and kind of following the rules and you know doing it right. And so their approach then that sort of leads to this very higher structured traditional approach to bonsai with very little kind of variation, because that's not culturally what Germans do. They follow the rules really well. Whereas in the U.S. we maybe value like individual freedom and creative kind of just not being bound by things, by people telling us what to do. And so maybe we're more apt to have bonsai that really are less similar or deviate more so than others from that tradition. And so can you think of any kind of like just cultural values within Australia that kind of would sort of that Australians kind of pride themselves in, or maybe not, that might influence this either approach to bonsai or their reluctance to embrace native species, or anything that you might think about that kind of could be like, oh, that's an Australian thing, or something like that?
Yeah, definitely. I guess one of the cultural sort of values that we sort of pride ourselves in is, is the, um, sorry, I just heard a really loud bang out there,
Mm,
is the propensity to sort of break rules in
mm,
some ways.
mm,
I mean, we started off as, you know, sort of putting the ancestral history of the Aborigines, the indigenous people of our land. When the first fleet arrived, and they were all convicts and they all broke rules, and the reason that's and that's sort of how
mm,
our culture in a lot of ways evolved. So I guess there are the rule breakers.
mm,
I probably put myself in one of those, in that
mm,
category.
mm,
I do like to kind of rock the boat a little bit.
mm,
Just it's not for the sake of rocking the boat. It's just more to get people to sort of see things a little bit different. Um, but I don't think that there's enough of that either. So there's a bit of a mix of. I think the mix is probably leans more to the traditional and sticking to the rules. And I guess it comes back to the amount of time that we've been doing bonsai for, the type of people that have been practicing the art, and I think the people that are emerging, coming up, I think that's where the change is definitely going to change. So
mm,
yeah, I think there definitely is. Again, it's a hard one to answer because we haven't been doing it long enough, but we're definitely not sticklers for rules. But I'd say that the majority, I mean, from my own point of view, I'm not a stickler for the rules, but the majority at this point of time, I still think that they still are.
mm,
They're very influenced by what they see online, and just you sort of go through social media, and it'll be stick in a pot, and I hate using that term, but that's the only way to sort of refer to it. But yet it kind of looks like every other stick in a pot, because that's the guidelines that they've followed the format, and the format is what they think is the only thing that looks like bonsai. Interestingly, going back to my friend Quentin Valentine, he has coastal tea trees are very. We grow a lot of them in Victoria because we have a ready good access to them, and a lot of I call them the juniper of natives because they lend themselves to sort of a lot of different sort of styles if you really wanted to use them, in that in that sense. And he's got a couple, and if you stood from far away, you would honestly think it was a juniper just because of the style, the shape that he has them, growing them. So, yeah, I think we have a way to go to, and I'm hoping I'm answering it. Again, it's sort of a little bit of a difficult one to answer, but I think we still have a bit of way to go to really develop, our own sense of style, our own unique sort of path in this, particularly when it comes to natives, but even with exotics. I would really like to see exotics just a little bit portrayed a little bit more different rather than the same.
Yeah, that's interesting. I guess, in your opinion, how do people who practice bonsai in Australia, traditional or natives or whatever, just in general, is there like a sense of kind of where where does Australia fall within kind of the global kind of realm of bonsai? Like, how do you guys see yourselves as practitioners within the global kind of bonsai community?
That's a good question. And I must admit, I've not really had that discussion with anybody. Maybe because I guess it's probably for two reasons. Maybe because we haven't been doing it for so long, and probably because a lot of collections are, other than acquiring and being lucky enough to acquire really old stock, and that's both exotic or native. There aren't many trees of provenance, that are around. There are definitely some of the Koroshoff trees are still sort of around, and where they are, there's rumours that there's some around, but I don't, I've never, other than a couple at the collection, I've never been, I've never seen them, and definitely, there are some artists that have passed on, and they had really nice trees, but those really nice trees were nice for the time that they were being styled. Do you know what I mean? Like if you go back to 20 years ago, or even 30 years ago, and you sort of see photos of how trees were styled there, and everyone thought they'd look great, and then you look at how things have changed and how things have moved. There's a massive, sort of space there, and things have obviously have happened, and trees have been taken, have taken a different path. And I'd say that's because they've probably come into the ownership of different people along the way, and then and they've had that provenance, and they've had that that history behind them. So to answer that question, I think that we definitely do have quite a few artists out there that are definitely have trees that are worthy of having international status. Definitely Quentin, does. I would like to think that some of mine probably do, but again, they're natives, so I'm fighting that uphill battle, to try to get the recognition. But yeah, there definitely is, and as I said, there's more younger up and coming people. Personally, I wish there was more women coming into it, but they're not. But it's just my personal thing.
Sure.
But yeah. So I hope that one, I sort of
Yeah,
answered
that's
that.
interesting. Yeah, I
It's
mean,
hard.
I'm curious too, because I think one of the things that I've also kind of noticed is that countries that tend to have had more have kind of established personalities, or quote unquote professionals, earlier, like the more there's been kind of like a designated leader or kind of multiple respected teachers within that country, that's led to kind of this faster kind of process. We kind of were talking about what are the things that are needed to kind of for this to kind of change, or for things to evolve, and so like time is one of them. And so you can think of a lot of the famous bonsai artists in Europe and in the US and in Japan, and I know of the Kirchhoffs, but I don't know, like from your perspective, like, are there other Australian artists that kind of or what has there been kind of artists, or was it much more kind of more regional, like club practitioners that were everyone was kind of just doing their own thing, or like was there anyone for like people to kind of rally around as like a leader in the community, or that I don't know, again, kind of the full story of that, but can you think, or can you see
Yeah.
any similarities, or is that something that Australia hasn't really had as much of someone of kind of like worldwide notoriety who is doing bonsai, or I don't know, I'm just curious
Yeah.
about what that would
No,
be.
that's an interesting one. We've definitely had, I would say, lacked having that. Um,
Hmm.
for a long time, particularly in Victoria. Um, we were bringing out, when I was a member of the other club, Bonsai Society of Victoria. They'd been bringing out Hiratoshi Sato,
Mm.
um, for like, I think it was like every 2 years or so, and they'd been bringing him out for a very long time. So you could definitely see the influence that having him out,
Hmm.
every sort of, so often had on the people, in their trees.
Mm.
Then we sort of, I remember, well, for whatever point, I think we struggled to fill up the workshops. I think some people, and maybe so some of the younger ones coming on, because it was definitely more for the older members.
Hmm.
Many more of the younger ones didn't seem as interested to have someone of his caliber, maybe working
Hmm.
on their trees.
Hmm.
So we noticed a lack of enthusiasm to having him come out. So we sort of stopped bringing him out. Recently, I walked away from the club for various reasons, and I think last year they brought him back out after, would have been about 8 years or something. So,
Hmm.
and there was definitely, they could see a change in how he was approaching his teachings, as opposed to how it was, back in whenever it was. So it's more of a regional thing, I would definitely say.
Hmm.
We have the visiting tutor program that's through the AABC. So, and you can put yourself, your club nominates, you nominate yourself, but your club's got to back you. And there's certainly I'm part of that, just recently joined it. And so I'm lucky that as I said to you before, I'm being called the native expert, but so that I get around. But we've definitely not had a consistent sort of, international artists coming out. So it's definitely been more club based, and definitely Quentin and a few others in the other clubs that I belong to were very prominent in those, in terms of, sort of imparting their knowledge or their design ideas.
Hmm.
And similarly, I think it's very much similar in mostly the other clubs as you work your way up the
Hmm.
coast, and even on the, in WA, and similarly in WA, in Tasmania. I was up in a small club like 2 weeks ago and doing a demonstration there, and it's a very small club. It's a regional club, and you can definitely see that there's a lack of someone that's a little bit more advanced, just by seeing the quality of their trees.
Hmm.
So I think, some clubs are very lucky that they have some people with with a lot of experience, and some clubs just don't, and they're the clubs that you just don't see much movement or much progression from. But I also too think that, personally, when I joined my first club that I joined, I could see that my progression wasn't going to improve by staying at that club,
Hmm.
and it was because I genuinely wanted to improve my knowledge level, and I
Hmm.
genuinely wanted to improve my trees. And this is when I was just doing exotics. So I went looking for other clubs where I knew my knowledge would be, heightened, and I would actually learn a lot more. And I definitely pinpointed the people that I could learn from. So
Hmm.
I think it's a personal thing. I also think
Hmm.
that if you really want to take, your bonsai journey seriously and actually have really nice quality trees, you'll go looking for that. Whereas you got some that are just doing it as a hobby
Sure.
and don't really care. So there is that difference as well.
Sure.
So yeah.
And so, kind of in the last few questions here, just out of respect for your time, do you see, like, what's the state of the clubs or the bonsai community? Do you feel like more people are becoming interested in bonsai? Is it kind of staying the same, or is it declining?
Yeah. We're pretty much, a lot of clubs are discussing this. We actually discussed this at the National Convention in May, what do clubs need to do to bring more people on board? Because obviously the demographics of most clubs is, you look around and it's pretty much grey hair everywhere,
Sure.
so they're, 60 plus. I guess trying to attract the younger ones who are very time poor, families, work, blah, 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 and is really difficult. And I think, and I don't have the answer to how this is going to happen, but we need to, the way clubs run, the way things are done at clubs probably needs to be a little bit more exciting rather than the same old, same old. Most, the younger ones, and I keep going, and I'm only 50, but, the 30, 40-year-olds grew up with this in their hands, I didn't. I wasn't of that generation. And they get entertainment just by doing that. So I think the YouTube, the videos and all those online things definitely have stopped many younger ones from joining the clubs because they just think, I could just learn it off from there. But you don't. Hands-on is much more important. And particularly with what I'm trying to do at the moment, I'm building my own business up and trying to get the tutoring side, sort of off the ground. And getting people to be interested in actually doing natives as bonsai, it's a big of a task. So, I'm finding my own battle with that. But yeah, look, I honestly don't have the answer as to how we can change it and make it more appealing to the younger ones. But it's something needs to change because I see a lot of these older clubs just having, folding at some point because we don't have that.
So it's declining. I mean, it's slowly, you say it's slowly declining rather than kind of just kind of staying the same.
Well,
like you're kind of
I
it.
guess declining in the sense of people joining clubs.
Yeah. Fair enough. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that there's probably interest out there, but
Sure.
it's more like, they get their resources from somewhere else. They get their information from somewhere else. Yeah.
Yeah. And the club model is, there's pros and cons to all of that, and it doesn't sort of align with everyone's practice. But out of curiosity too, maybe our second to last question here is, you talked about the public responding to your tree that was a native. Like, how does the general public think of bonsai when they see it? Is it just kind of like a hobby or like a gardening thing or art? Like what's the average response or idea of what bonsai is to people in Australia? If you just ask someone up the street, like, what's a bonsai? They're like, I don't know, what is it?
Yeah, that's an interesting question as well. I think it's a bit of a mixed answer because you get definitely when we have our exhibition, we're sort of very prominent to, very close to a big fresh food market. So we tend to get quite a few people coming over because of, they see the signage. And some people have no idea about what bonsai is and sort of like they go, didn't know what this was about. And you definitely get, I guess, the artist, the ones that are, have some sort of artist interest, art interest, they sort of see it, they see it as an art. They definitely see it as an art. And then you get the horticulturists that sort of just come as a curiosity and they go, oh, geez, I didn't know that, you could do this to a native or, speaking of natives, obviously, and, didn't know you could do this to a native. I didn't know you could bonsai so and so and so. So, yeah, I think it's a bit of a mixed match, a big, mixed bag in terms of what people, the general public think. But I also do believe, though, that the general public have this idea of bonsai and it's that triangular shape. Right. So anything that fits within that triangular shape, because I think that most people have just seen, they might have occasioned through, I don't know, a post or seen something, or even like, I don't know if you see, you probably do notice it, but like in some TV shows, and you'll see the bonsai in the background, and a lot of the times, it'll be in an office or something, and it's very triangular, or with the juniper, that sort of cascading or whatever. And so they have the two misconceptions. They have that triangular shape, and the other thing is that they can keep it indoors. So and you get that misinformation happening again, and then when I know that I particularly like to display, going back to the semi-deciduous state, when I display most of my trees at our exhibition, they tend to trim them quite hard, sort of probably about a month or so, or 2 months before, so that I've got that open, foliage pads, which I really like and which I believe he represents our trees much more. And I do tend to get the comments of, oh, it's a bit bare, and because again, they're so used to having that fuller canopy of a pine or a juniper or of a an English elm or something like that, which can be quite dense. So yeah, yes, I think it's a mixed bag, to be honest with you. The public and even people that join clubs have misconceptions as well. So, but yeah, look, I think we're in terms of population. I mean, we're only 26 million or something. So I don't even know I have no idea what the practice, the number of people practicing bonsai here would be, but it's small. It's nothing big. So in comparison, but yeah, I really honestly do hope that it doesn't go, fall by the wayside, and it's an art form that keeps being pursued. And it's also, I want my trees to pass on to somebody else and for them to take them, into the next, reiteration of what they could possibly be. And all of us are facing that. We're all getting older, and we need to be able to pass these trees on to somebody. And the scary part is that we're not getting those younger ones in yet, or if they are, they come in, hang around for a while, and then they sort of fleet, and you don't see them again. So yeah, I think I don't know if you're experiencing the same thing over there, but it's definitely what's happening here, or what I've noticed anyway.
Yeah. No, I think you're on the right track with trying to encourage of appreciation for native plants and appreciation for the environment and the trees that sort of reflect that, because I think that's what people are more likely going to eventually kind of hopefully come to value, but also have that connection with more directly than something that's not that familiar. So yeah, hopefully that's going to continue to kind of pay off as you guys continue to kind of so into that approach. And so I think what you're doing is really admirable, and definitely it sounds like you're trying everything you can to figure out how to appeal to a broader audience. And yeah, I think that valuing of native material and emphasizing its sort of relationship to bigger ideas and sort of our connection with nature is definitely something that people, younger people, are much more connected with and aware of and value. So yeah, really fascinating. I just want to say thanks so much for making the time and chatting with me. And yeah, I'm looking forward to kind of seeing how to incorporate your information into this exhibition, and we'll just continue to keep you in the loop. And if I have any follow-up questions or anything like that, I'll be sure to circle back with you. But yeah, I just really want to say thank you for taking the time out of your morning to chat with me.
No, thank you. No, thank you for your interest. Yeah, it was it was really nice, and going through the questions and just getting me to think about things that I sort of hadn't really thought about. Sometimes you just sort of do things by osmosis and you don't really think about things. So it was interesting. So I appreciate that. So yeah, I look forward to whatever. If you need anything else, and if I'm part of it, it'd be great. You can share it with me. That would be that really be really exciting.
I'll keep you in the loop. And if anything comes to mind kind of later down the road, if you kind of have a more thoughts on something we've discussed, or something you had to think about more, I'd love to hear any kind of inspirational things you come up with afterwards. So well, thank you, Marcela. Appreciate you.
Thank you.
And we'll talk to you later.
Nice meeting you. Thank
Okay,
you.
you too.
Take care.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye.